Okay, so hello everybody, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. This webinar is around disability and disability inclusion in the workplace and supporting your disabled clients and customers. So just a quick introduction from me. My name is Essie Hardy. I run and founded a business called Celebrating Disability, and today I'm partnering with Parapride, the LGBT plus and disability charity. So Celebrating Disability as a disability inclusion business, I deliver training, although not so much right now, and consultancy and auditing to businesses and not-for-profits around disability inclusion and how to be more supportive of disabled people in the workplace, whether those disabled people be customers or whether they be employees of the organisation. So Parapride have asked me to help out with this webinar, just to run through a few essential bits that you might need to know in order to be inclusive of disabled people when you're supporting them, when you're delivering their services. So obviously, you might have questions that arise at any point. If you do have those questions, if you just type them in the chat box, we have time for questions and answers towards the end. I think would be the easiest on this platform. However, if you do need anything clarifying as we're going through, also do put it in the chat box. And Lucy and I will endeavour to have a look at it and answer any clarifications as we go on. Lucy, can we skip 2 slides forward, please? Perfect. So we've just got a few items that we're going to cover specifically in this webinar, hopefully to give you a good general awareness and overview of the importance of disability inclusion and what it might mean for your charity or not-for-profit. So the first thing we're going to look at is why disability inclusion and awareness are so important. We're also going to look at the difference between awareness itself and inclusion. You might hear me kind of interchanging the words quite a lot, but I will clarify what those words mean and why they are different. We'll look at what a disability is and the vast breadth of disability. And then we'll look at 3 theories surrounding disability inclusion, which has got us to today to understand how disabled people can be valuable assets in society and how to make that happen. We'll look at some of the barriers that disabled people face on a daily basis, and what also you can do within your organisations to mitigate some of those barriers once you understand what they are. We'll have some learning outcomes so that you can have a think about where you might start to be aware and inclusive of disabled people within your organisations and support them to want to come and use your services. And then obviously, of course, at the end, we've got a section for your questions and your answers, what you might want to answer, but your questions, and for me to have an opportunity to try and answer some of those questions that you might have. Can we have the next slide, please, Lucy? Thank you. So to start with, why is this important? So there are many protected characteristics, priorities that we talk about a lot of the time. Personally, I feel that the main ones that we cover a lot are women, and we cover BAME quite a lot. And those 2 are really, really important, but it quite often means that a lot of the characteristics that are equally as important and equally need to be prioritised in our thinking and missed out. And those things quite often are things like LGBTQ+, disability, age, religion, and all of those things. So one of the reasons, which isn't on the slide, but why it's important, is that it needs to be recognised as a priority, because, as it says, 14 million disabled people are in the UK, and just over 7 million of those disabled people are in employment at the moment. So that means a lot of disabled people around looking for employment. And that also means that a lot of disabled people are out using services. And quite often, a misinterpretation is that disabled people are in silos. So just because one disabled person comes to use your service and they don't have a good experience, business owners and people that run organizations quite often think, well, that's one person, that's all right. But actually, disabled people have families and they have friends. So what happens is when we're not inclusive of disabled people, we're not aware of their needs and the barriers that disabled people face, is that they go home and they tell their friends and families and they put it on social media and we share it with everybody else. And then it's not just us that doesn't come back to use that service, it's everybody else that we have talked to and interacted with. And also the other thing is that when we are using services as disabled people, it's very rare, obviously in some situations like youth clubs, but in other situations, it's very rare that we would use those services on our own. So we would be wanting to bring in our friends and family. It might also be that the person that sees your services for the first time is not disabled themselves. So by not helping them to understand how aware and inclusive you are of disabled people, they won't tell their disabled family member, their relative, or their friend that your service is the best service to look for. So it's really important when thinking about why you prioritise disability to understand that disability stretches wider than one person. It's everybody that surrounds it as well. Disability is more than you can see. And by that, I mean that a lot of disability is hidden. So just over 10% of disabled people are physically disabled. So I myself am physically disabled. I'm a wheelchair user. And some of these slides have a mixed race person in a wheelchair. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, looks like me. It's not me, but I'm a mixed race person in a wheelchair. But just over 10% of disabled people, as I say, are physically disabled. Just under 90% of disabled people have hidden disabilities. So just because you can't see a disability doesn't mean it's not there. And the breadth of disability, as we'll look at in a minute, is so vast that it's important to have a general overview. You don't specifically need to know everything about every different impairment group, but a general overview of how disability can affect different groups of people in order to have a generalistic way of supporting them when they come to use your service. Awareness, attitude, and strategy. So I think this is a really good opportunity for me to explain a little bit about the difference between awareness and inclusion. So in very simple terms, I think that awareness is passive. So when you're aware of something, you might go along to a training session and the person might have talked to you for, I don't know, a length of time, and you think, oh, well, that's really, really interesting. But, you know, there's nothing I can do because that was all it was. It was interesting. So now I'm going to go back to my job and do what I was doing before. So you've been passive in it, and it's been passive information that's been passed down to you. Inclusion is active, and by that I mean that you are given the information to be aware of, let's say, the barriers that disabled people face, but you're also given the tools to then go away and do something about it. Awareness is so important, but because without awareness, without the knowledge of what the problem is, or without the knowledge of the fact that people want to be supported, or that people want to be involved, or that people want to be valued, then we can't be inclusive and do something about it. So the two things do work hand in hand. But that is how I define awareness and how I define attitude. And then so strategy comes into that. And I think that sometimes when we think of strategy, it's quite kind of an overwhelming concept that we need to sit down with a massive piece of paper and strategize. But it's not necessarily true. I mean, by the end of today's section, hopefully I will have given you enough information to come up with very simple strategies that you'll be able to implement. And those strategies might be how to talk to a disabled person, or how to make sure that your venue and your room that you're having your service in is set up in such a way that if somebody needs a bit of extra support, that extra support is accessible for them to move around. That could be a strategy. So strategies do not have to be complicated. They can be something quite simple, and then there are things that you can build on after that. Encouraging, championing, celebrating inclusion. So it's really important, you know, when I hear quite a lot when I'm talking and when I'm speaking to businesses, they say, oh, we don't care about disability, or we don't see disability. And I say, well, I get your sentiment that you don't care about disability. I think that you should change that. So what you mean is, what you are saying is that it's not that you don't care, but you don't see disability as a barrier to work in your service or to deliver your product or whatever. So you're actually celebrating the difference of a disabled person. And when people say, I don't see disability, I say that, you know, they say it to me quite often, I don't see you as a disabled person, Essie. And I understand the sentiment. And the sentiment is that they don't see anything that's different or wrong, unquote, wrong with me. They see me as a person. But first of all, I say, well, how can you not see it? I'm sitting in a wheelchair. Unless you have a sight impairment, you do see my disability. And also, it's not a bad thing to see my disability. As I said here, disability is something that should be celebrated, and it's something that should be championed for the assets and the potential that somebody with a disability has, and the different experiences that somebody with a disability brings, that somebody without a disability might not have, because they haven't gone through the same experiences of discrimination, of adversary, as of something else that a disabled person has. Obviously, a lot of these things are cross-sectional, so just because they apply for disabled people doesn't mean they don't apply for another characteristic, like LGBTQ, for example. Another thing that I didn't put here is that disability is intersectional. And by that I mean that just because I am physically disabled doesn't also mean I'm not a woman, and doesn't also mean that I'm not mixed race, and might not also mean that I have a family. And if you had been here before, you would have heard that Robbie Williams is my ultimate favourite. And that I love chocolate. So the point of intersectionality is recognizing that somebody isn't just what they're presenting as, that there's so much more, and that the whole person, the holistic view of the person, makes up that individual as a whole. So remembering that disability is intersectional is really important. And also, the reason why disability inclusion and awareness is so important is that it does support organisational growth. If you think about the fact that there are 14 million disabled people in the UK, if, for example, you were doing things that didn't attract disabled people, or you were completely uninclusive of disabled people, or you refused to talk to them and you turned your back on them, which I know is not the case, that was an extreme example, then you're missing out on lots of people that you can have supporting your service. Can we have the next slide, please, Lucy? Thank you. So understanding disability. So under the Equality, some people may have seen this before. So under the Equality Act 2010, a person is disabled if they have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial or long-term negative effect on their ability to do normal daily activities. So because of that, and that statement is deliberately kind of generalistic so that it can encompass so many things. Quite often when I deliver training courses, when I've talked about this section within my courses, people within those training courses say to me, oh, I didn't realize I fit into this category because I have this impairment, or I struggle with this. So disability isn't just the obvious ones that we think about, it can be a lot more. So there are 5 categories of disability. So physical, i.e. somebody whose limbs are affected by their disability. Mental health disability, i.e. somebody who might be struggling with depression or stress or anxiety related, perhaps something a bit more serious, perhaps something that they come in and out of. Sensory disability, which is our senses. So essentially, partially sighted or blind, hard of hearing or deaf, something other to do with our senses. Learning disabilities, and quite often people get the mental health disabilities and learning disabilities a bit confused, and I think that's because historically, when we've talked about people with learning disabilities, we've talked about them being mentally disabled, and that's not true, because a learning disability affects somebody's cognitive ability to learn in the same way. So, for example, probably quite a well-known example of that is Down syndrome, but also other learning disabilities could be dyslexia and could be dyspraxia. So again, the breadth of disability within learning disability is quite varied. And then autism and neurodiverse disabilities as well are disabilities on their own. And again, quite often they club together with learning disabilities. But an important distinction is that learning disability and autism and neurodiverse are different categories within disability. We just have a few other facts that you might have seen before here. So 80% of disability is acquired, which means that people that acquire disabilities are not born with their disabilities. So I've been disabled for my whole life, so I didn't acquire my disability. But for example, an acquired disability might be multiple sclerosis, my apologies, get my teeth back in, might be something that you acquire in later life. It might be an accident, it might be a brain injury, something neurological like that. Less than 10% of disabled people are wheelchair users. And I do realise I said before just over 10%, but this is the correct fact, that just less than 10% of disabled people are wheelchair users, and less than 6% of that 10% are full-time wheelchair users. So I think that's an important fact to kind of note, because I think that when we look at disability, when we think about disability through no fault of our own, because of the imagery that's around and because of the perceptions of disability and what's shown to us in the media and the representation of disability, we immediately jump to disability being a wheelchair user. But it's important to remember that wheelchair users are a very, very small percentage of the disabled people population. And I think that's important to understand, and we'll talk about this a bit more in detail later, but when we are designing the physical aspect, the accessibility of our services, and I realize sometimes it's not possible to make it truly accessible, but it's not just enough to create something that is accessible from the entrance to the hallway. So from the front door, into the entranceway. People think that if they get the front door accessible, then everything else will flow. But actually, it's about what happens after you get in the front door. What are the attitudes of staff? So when I was thinking about how to design the content for this webinar, I was thinking about perhaps some of the buildings of you guys listening in might be old buildings that can't be made accessible, and that might be an anxiety that stops you, that you might think stops you from being inclusive. But actually physical access, although it is quite important, is only one step to being inclusive of disabled people. A much bigger step is your attitude and your communication. So I always say I'd much rather be in a restaurant where I've struggled to get inside but I feel welcome, than sitting in a restaurant where everybody's ignoring me. So it's much more important to show that you value people, because there are always ways round a situation than to actually be fully accessible and then to ignore people when they're in there. I mean, obviously, if you can get both, then that's perfect. But we don't live in a perfect world, do we? So sometimes some things have to come first and other things can be built upon. Can we have the next slide, please, Lucy? Thank you. So when we were talking about the 3 models of disability, I'm about to explain the first 2. So the social model of disability, and I should have explained at the beginning, I'm going to read out all the content on the slide in case anyone has any access requirements. This is also a really good kind of thing to think about when you are kind of delivering services or hosting events for people, that actually people in the room might have different access requirements that they don't want to tell you about. So if you can do things that support everybody in the first place, then it might take some of those barriers away without even knowing that you're doing it for a specific person. So I'm just going to read these slides. So the social model of disability. The social model of disability suggests that if society was built with the needs of disabled people in mind, nobody would be excluded. Instead, we would live in a society where disability alone would not impede people from achieving their goals. So before I go on to explain the next, in summary, it means that it's not the impairment that disables a person. So in my situation, it's not the fact that I'm a wheelchair user and all 4 of my limbs are affected that stops me from getting up a flight of stairs. It's that, or getting up to the first floor, I should say. It's the fact that there's stairs and no lift that's stopping me from getting up to the first floor. And so that is the very basics of the social model of disability. So in the social model of disability, there are 3 areas to think about. There's the environment, which is the physical environment, which I have just explained, things like steps. There is attitude, so the attitudes of the people who are talking to disabled people. If people feel that disabled people don't deserve or aren't worth building accessible environments and inclusive environments, then they're not going to do it. And the last one is organisation. So what organisations can do to be inclusive and aware of disability. So the biggest example of organisation is central government. So for example, central government recognises that disabled people are at a disadvantage when it comes to finances. On average, a disabled person's living expenses is £550 more per month than a non-disabled person. And that is because of a lot of things. That could be because of transportation, that could be because of extra heating, because people can't get out as much. It might be because of extra clothing, because people's disability means that they have to change their clothing a few more times a day. It might be because of specialist equipment like hoists in their houses and bungalows, which are always more expensive than 2 or 3 story houses, but don't get me started. It might be lack of provision of accessible housing, which also is a big bugbear of mine, which I won't get started on today. But all these things mean that the living expenses for disabled people are much higher than they are for non-disabled people. Another example, so the government, I went off track, I forgot what I was saying, sorry. So the government has put in a benefit system for disabled people to recognise that when they are disabled, regardless of other circumstances, their disability is putting them at a disadvantage. So we're given, we have to apply for it and be to reach the criteria, but then we're given money throughout our working life, regardless of our income. So it's not means tested because of the disadvantages that we face due to our disability. So in contrast to this is the medical model of disability. And the medical model of disability leaves the burden of exclusion to the person with the impairment. And by that I mean society or a business would look at me and say, oh, well, we've got, our meeting is on the first floor. We've got stairs. It's not our problem that you can't get upstairs. You'll just have to deal with it, and we'll just call down to you once an hour. And that might seem an extreme example, but I worked at an organisation where the director of the organisation was a wheelchair user, and he went to a meeting. And that's exactly what happened to him. They knew he was coming along, and they knew he was a wheelchair user, and they hadn't put provision in place. And it was a really important meeting, and he had to sit downstairs, and somebody relayed the information that was being told, because they hadn't thought about what they could do to mitigate the fact that he can't climb stairs. There could have been very easy things they could do, like move the meeting to another floor. If there was not another room available on the floor that he was on, maybe move the venue, maybe have an online option. So the point of the medical model is that it's only looking at things that people can't do, not the potential of what they can do with a bit of support. So there's just a diagram here, diagram of the medical model. So the medical model thinks about stairs, escalators, not the one size fits all, and they've got very negative attitudes towards disabled people. Or you're disabled, so you can't possibly have this advantage. It's thought, you know, the medical model comes a lot in the recruitment stage. So, for example, because of the attitudes and the barriers to education and to people's attitude towards what disabled people can learn, quite often when they go for a job interview, disabled people, and I should say we rather than they, because I am a disabled person, we face the barrier of not having such a full CV quite often than a non-disabled person. So an inclusive employer that thinks about the social model of disability would think, well, you know, qualifications and past experience when it comes to work-related past experience is only one way of demonstrating ability. We're going to actually look at the person and see what they're capable of, because we understand those barriers that might have been in place that stop them from getting all of that. Whereas somebody who's looking from a medical model and a very exclusive point of view would think, well, you know, it's not there, we don't want to hire them, they're probably going to be an issue anyway. So the social model of disability in this diagram, there are ramps and lifts instead of stairs. There's things like closed captions on videos. So for example, even if you have a hearing impairment, you can still follow along on a video recording because there's closed captions or subtitles to read. There's a very positive out-of-the-box thinking. So, oh, Essie can't do this because she can't climb those stairs and she can't use her hands in that way. What could we do? How can we include her in this so that she can give the same value? And it's just a generally inclusive approach. Can we please have the next slide? Thank you. So another model that we're going to discuss is the charity model. So again, I'll just read. The charity model implies that the disabled person can't do anything for themselves. Instead, they're relying on the generosity and sympathy of others to provide. In the case of the charity model, the disabled person is helpless and relies on charity of others to survive. This model does not just relate to disability. So you may have seen this, I would be surprised if you haven't, on television ads for donations to charities like Oxfam. They have black and white photos where they have sad music and then uplifting music at the end when they're given like £5 to live off for the next year, and it's all because the kindness of the British people have donated money for this to happen. So the charity model in terms of disability works on exactly the same premise, that actually in order for disabled people to survive, there has to be other people, other really generous, sympathetic people who want to give up their time to help us helpless disabled people. Now, I know I sound very cynical, and I'm kind of deliberately sounding very cynical to get the idea of the charity model across. Sometimes the charity model is very helpful, but what it does is it stops people from thinking about disabled people as valuable assets and valuable members of society. If we only think about disabled people as being helpless and people that can't do for themselves and need others to do for them, all we are as disabled people are burdens. Therefore, nobody's going to think about including us in their services. Nobody's going to think about how to make a business more inclusive or accessible of disabled people. Nobody's going to think about becoming aware of disability, because actually it won't matter, because all they need is a handout anyway. So it's a way of redefining, well, rethinking what disability is and what disabled people are capable of if given half the opportunity. So again, in this diagram, the charity model would say was like they, them. So when we define people, there's the them and us theory, that if we can say us, then we and them. When we're saying them, we can separate ourselves from the situation, and we don't have to think about the situation as it pertains to ourselves. But the problem with that is that we lose the ability to empathise with people, which is the big difference between sympathy and empathy. Empathising with somebody's situation in order to help them the way that they would want to be helped. It also, you know, another word that comes to mind when I think about the charity model is suffering. Oh, bless them, poor disabled person. Again, when I go back to talking about, I don't see you as disabled. Oh, you're not disabled to me. Well, what's so wrong with being disabled? I'm not suffering from being disabled. And another saying that people say quite often is, what's wrong with you? I just say, there's nothing wrong with me, what's wrong with you? If you're talking about my disability, that's a completely different question. But the idea that we're suffering for being disabled and not, it's not an advantage and it's not an asset in any way. And then the other kind of, in quotes, I put, thank God it's not us. So thank God it's over there and it's not happening here. And poor them, poor them, poor them. Okay, can we have the next slide, please, Lucy? So I thought about some barriers that are presented to disabled people. And obviously there is a lot more barriers than the ones I have put on this list, but I thought that these are the common barriers that allow me to talk in more depth about what could potentially happen, and then it would cover a bit more. But obviously it's important to know that every disabled person, because every person is unique and everybody has individual experiences and needs, barriers are going to be specific to their needs. Some of the barriers are going to be quite generalized, and I might have the same barriers as another disabled person, but then again, another disabled person, even with the same disability and impairment as I, would have completely different barriers than I have. But these are some that I've kind of come up with. So lack of support. So we think lack of support kind of rounds up everything that I've been saying so far, that actually, because of what people feel about disability, and also because of the fear that comes along when presented with a disabled person. I think that personally, I think that because disability hasn't historically been talked about in schools and education, a lot of the older generation and my generation, and I was born in the early 80s, aren't really comfortable around disabled people. And I know I'm generalizing, but a lot of people aren't. And because of that, they don't know how to ask people what they would like or if they would like support. So it's much easier not to offer support and just to pretend it's not happening. Again, I know that I'm very much generalizing, and this is not the same for everybody. Also, not knowing what support disabled people need, not taking the time to generate that awareness of disability, means that support won't be in place. So, for example, if you didn't know that a wheelchair user's wheelchair could not climb stairs, you wouldn't think about the fact that you might have to put a ramp in. And I know that's a very obvious one because we all know that wheels can't climb stairs, but you get what I'm saying. But if you're not aware of the physical support or the attitudinal support that a disabled person needs, then you can't put that support in place in the first place. So, for example, when we go back to the slide where we were talking about the different categories of disability, if we think about for a minute autism, so some of the barriers, some of the areas where autistic people need support is in a sensory way. So, for example, somebody with autism would find it very difficult to be in a massive open space room with lots of people bustling around and making lots of noise. Somebody with autism would need to have a quiet space where there would be a quiet space for them to go to at any time. They would generally have to have things set up in a very certain way to be able to work or take part in the activity in a way that's meaningful for them. They may, depending on their impairment, they may not be able to work in groups for a long period of time. They may need specific, sorry, I forgot the word, specific instructions to tasks. So, for example, if you were planning an activity, instead of just expecting people to know what they were going to do in this activity, say it's wall climbing or something, with an autistic person, you would have to go through step by step what is expected of them and what's going to happen, why it's going to happen, and at what stages it's going to happen. So by understanding those barriers, understanding that need for that person, you can put in the right levels of support. You can have that dedicated person, if needed, to explain those steps. Or you can, as the instructor yourself, just bring the whole group in and explain the steps to the whole group. So the whole group is supportive in that way. But unless you understand those needs, then you can't put in the support. So that's what the lack of support is. And so on the opposite side of the slide, I've got ways to mitigate these barriers. So I think I've just talked about that in detail, but empathy and generosity of time is a big thing. And another thing I would say with this lack of support, if you don't know, ask a person. So if you're not sure what they need, and they do have the capacity and they can tell you, they'll probably tell you what they need themselves. In some cases, perhaps with somebody with learning disability or perhaps somebody on the autistic spectrum wouldn't be able to tell you what they need. But in those situations, they probably have a family member or a personal assistant or a support worker that would be able to tell you what they needed in order to fully participate in the activity. But what I would say is never be afraid of asking those questions and delving in as deep as you need to in order to find the right answers to provide the right support. Another barrier presented to disabled people is non-disclosure of disability. And I think presented to disabled people might be the wrong way of putting it. But the reason why disabled people don't always disclose their disability is because we are scared of what will happen as a result. So again, if I walked into, or if I rolled in my wheelchair, I do say walked, if I walked into your offices, you would know instantly that I was disabled. However, my personal assistant, my support worker, has fibromyalgia, which is a hidden disability, and you would not know that she was disabled, but she might need certain support things. So she needs to take breaks semi-regularly to make sure that her muscles don't seize up and she doesn't get overtired. But she might be worried about telling you that because you as a service provider or an employer might think, well, that's going to be a pain. She's not going to work as productively as somebody that doesn't have a disability. Therefore, we're not going to offer the job. We're not going to invite her to join our service. So disabled people quite often don't disclose their disabilities, but by not disclosing their disabilities, they can't have the support they need. Because like I said before, unless you know what somebody needs, you can't put in the support. And I know this is quite complicated, but it's important to think about this holistically so that when in a minute we're going to think about how you kind of design, how you talk about your services so disabled people know that they're going to be valued and welcomed by you. But by putting those things in place, then a disabled person is more likely to say to you, oh, you know, I do have this access requirement. Can we please work out how we would work together? And then you don't have to have all the answers straight away or even at all, but you can work together to make something equally as valuable for both you and the disabled person. So ways to mitigate the non-disclosure of disability is showing that you are inclusive and that you celebrate difference. And that isn't always the physical kind of, oh, here's our accessible building, because as I said, I know that's not possible, but it might be having things on your website that say, unfortunately, we are a listed building and we are on the 3rd floor. However, these are the things that we would like to do to include you. And they could be a number of things that I'm happy to talk to you about for your individual needs at a later date. Physical access is a massive barrier for disabled people. And we've talked a lot about that. So where possible, putting in portable ramps or changes of venues. And I know, again, it's not always possible because sometimes it is down to budgets. But you know, if you are designing kind of an activity and you've got like a youth club centre, it's not very possible to change venues. But again, I think I would refer back to having that communication, opening those doors of communication so people can say, well, this is what I've done in the past. And it might, if you're working with young people, it might not be the young people themselves that are able to come up with the answers. But trust me, parents of disabled children are used to brainstorming and finding solutions to issues because the education system quite often puts up a lot of these barriers a lot of the time. So if you talk to those parents and you show them that you want to be as inclusive and as welcoming as possible, then they will be more likely to open up those conversations with you to find the answers you're looking for. A lack of opportunities for disabled people. So because of everything listed above, so the lack of support, the worrying about non-disclosure of disability, the lack of physical access and lots of other things, attitudes, organisations not wanting to include disabled people, education not putting enough energy into supporting disabled people to achieve, we have lack of opportunities. So I mean that could be something basic. So if let's say your youth club was in Soho in central London and your venue, let's say your venue is accessible, but the routes to your venue are not accessible, I still can't come. So thinking about those barriers that people face, you might not be able to come up with answers to all of them, but thinking around them will help you to open up those means of communication with the service users and their families. And so the ways to mitigate that barrier, I would say changing structural processes to opportunity. And by that, I mean structural processes might be, for example, in order to join our youth club, you have to fill in this application form this way by this time. And that's a structural process. That's the way you structure your process. So by changing that structure and saying, okay, you don't have to do it like this. We can talk to you on the phone, or we can come and see you, or we can have an informal chat on the phone or whatever, means that you are opening those opportunities to everybody else. Or for example, if you're a theatre, a youth theatre group, for example, and it said that you have to, the people that join your theatre group have to have had 4 examples of when they've been in plays in the past, but they haven't had those opportunities because every other theatre group has thought, oh, well, they're disabled, they can't perform, they're not going to be able to show a character properly. So thinking about the reasons why they might not have those opportunities in the past, not just because they're untalented, might help you to give them opportunities now. I really hope that all makes sense. I am very aware that, you know, I can't see anybody's faces or react to what they're thinking. So please do ask me as many questions as you want in a minute. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so we've just got a few learning outcomes. I'll just take a breath and let you just digest everything that I've just said, because I do realize I've said a lot, and give myself a chance to take a sip of my drink. Okay, so we've come up with 3 learning outcomes and places to start when thinking about being more aware and more inclusive of your disabled customers. So first of all, I would say just simply start a conversation. And I've put, if you don't know where to start with hello. It's quite often scarier than you think. If you're not sure what support somebody needs, ask them and they will be able to provide you and tell you the answer. So I had an experience a little while ago. I was networking at a conference in London, and I'd been talking to this person for 20 minutes, and we were talking all about business, and we were talking about your families and everything possible. And then this person said to me, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Oh, of course." And they said, "How do I talk to a disabled person?" And I said, "Well, you're talking to one now." And the person literally just went, "Oh my gosh, oh yes, you're right." And so I think sometimes the barrier for non-disabled people is getting over that nervousness about disabled people. So in another situation, I advise for a marketeer who wants to be more inclusive of disabled people. And he wanted to put on a focus group to ask disabled people a little bit more about how he can develop a service to be inclusive. And he was asking me how what he needed to do to put on this focus group. And so I was explaining for about 10 minutes what I would do if I was going to put on a focus group and how to market it and everything. And then I stopped and I said, "Hang on a minute, Ray, you're the marketer, not me. Why are you asking me these questions? Because I'm not telling you anything specific about disability. I'm telling you how to market a focus group." And I said, "I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's because the word disability is in there." And he said, "Yeah, I think you're right." And I said, "If you remove disability, you know exactly what you're doing." And then he was able to put on, able to plan and market his focus group, and it was really successful. And so sometimes I think the word disability can be the disabling factor for lots of people when they're thinking about communicating and talking. So for some disabled people, obviously there are going to be other things that you have to take into account, but you're not going to know that unless you start that conversation in the first place. So that would be my first kind of suggestion, to just start, and then you can go from what the person tells you. So if they say, "Actually, I'm completely deaf, I can lip read, you have to look at me," then you're going to know that, but you're not going to know that until you have that conversation. And then the second one is consider the messages that you can share with your team and with your customers. So I put the simplest messages are often the most effective. So share the slide deck with your team and for your customers. Consider ways you can show how you might celebrate disability. So it might be really simply by the initial greeting, or by ensuring front of house staff know where the access is. And these, these might sound really simple, but they're quite often missed out. So, for example, I have part of my cerebral palsy means I've got limited dexterity. So I can shake a hand, but I can't open my hand up like a non-disabled person or a non-physically disabled person would be able to shake a hand, because I can't open it up that way. So people go to shake my hand and I give them my hand, and then they get all funny and pull it back. And that tells me that actually they're not as confident around disabled people as they could be, because other people just take my fist and shake my fist. So by helping your staff to know it's okay to do things slightly differently, that could be just the first step. And then ensuring front of house staff know where the access is. Again, I've been into buildings where I've said, where's the accessible toilet? And people don't know where it is. So very simple things. And that might not be the case if you're on the 3rd floor and you're inaccessible, but there may be other things. For example, do you have, if a disabled person says to you, do you have a format where I don't have to read the information? So for example, in large print or audio, and the front of house staff can say, oh yes, no, I can send it to your email address. It's much better than saying, oh, I don't know, I've never heard of it. Even if they don't know, they can say, I'm not sure, I will find out and get back to you within X amount of time. And then take time to look at your structural processes. Is there anything you can change? So for example, does every meeting have to take place face-to-face? So I know, again, if you deliver, you know, a youth club or something, the youth club is in a specific venue, but if there are little structural processes that you can change. So as I said before, only 10% of disabled people are wheelchair users, only less than 10% of disabled people are wheelchair users. So if, for example, if you have somebody on the autistic spectrum, for example, in your youth club, and you don't have a break for 2 hours at a time, it might be worth considering putting in a few extra breaks. It might be worth considering when you're explaining what you're going to do in the evening or in the day or whenever you have your club, that you sit down and break it down into manageable chunks so somebody on the autistic spectrum can understand. It might be worth, in case you have people with ADHD, attention hyperactive deficit, that you might want to offer a quiet space or offer a place for them to leave, so that if somebody does have to get up and jump around when you're having quiet time, it's not going to be something they're told off for. So just basically thinking about ways that you can make your service as inclusive as possible to disabled people, with understandably the limitations that you might have because of your venue sizes and your budgets at the moment. It doesn't all have to come down to really expensive strategies. It can start with the really basic, simple things of just thinking about it in a different way. Can we please have the next slide? Thank you very much, and thank you very much. I hope that's been really helpful. Does anyone have any questions?